The results are in. Who won the 2024 South African election? Who were the real winners at the end of the day? Let's chat about it. Yeah. Spread the fire. We have now gotten past the election. 29th of May is over, but the election is not yet done for South Africans in the 2024 national and provincial elections. So yes, the results are in. We have seen the most dramatic election in the history of South Africa with the ANC, the juggernaut that is the ANC, the liberation movement party that has governed this country, the party of Nelson Mandela, as people would call it, has gone not just below 50% in this election nationally, but has gone as low as 40% nationally and has lost 3 provinces in the process, has lost Gauteng, has lost the Northern Cape, and by a huge margin has lost KZN. And so the ANC only comes out of this with 5 victories in 5 provinces, having, of course, also lost the Western Cape, which it didn't have in the beginning. And so this election has shifted things dramatically just on the basis of the ANC's losses. And so while it's easy to tell who lost in this election, the question is who won? Who won this election? Who were the biggest winners and who gained in this election? So if we look at the parliament that we've got, the parliamentary seats that we've got, and even the votes that came through, the Umkhonto we Sizwe party is, of course, as we've said a few times, the big story of this election. With over 2 million votes, that is no small feat in a first election, even for a party that is a breakaway from a big party like the ANC. The biggest party before this in their first election was COPE with 1.3 million votes. In this election, we have fewer people who have voted, but we have a party that has come through and blown everyone out of the water. Now, there were many casualties when it came to the MK. I think across the board, parties just lost votes or did not grow. The EFF were definitely affected by the Umkhonto we Sizwe party, particularly in KZN, but elsewhere as well. You didn't see the growth of any party except the IFP in real numbers. Somehow, I think it's actually a magical story of this election, that the IFP were able to stay at the level that they were and actually get more votes than they did in the last election, despite having a really tough time like everyone else did, with Umkhonto we Sizwe surging in KZN. In KZN, Umkhonto we Sizwe is not only the highest party with about 45% of the vote, but it has taken the ANC from about 50% of the vote in 2019 all the way down to 17%. That is extraordinary. In the process, casualties like the EFF and the IFP and the DA to a certain extent are there. But really, the biggest winners of this election has to be Umkhonto we Sizwe, without a doubt. And everybody else has been harmed along the way. Now, there are 2 parties that came out of this pretty well. One of them is the DA. The DA is a winner in this election in that although it didn't increase in its actual number of votes, it wasn't hit as hard by the surge of MK. And one can easily say that that's on the basis of just ideological differences, constituency differences. MK was probably not going for the same kinds of constituencies that the DA was going for. And you can see that reflected in a few other parties. FF Plus, I don't think that the MK party did a lot of damage to the FF Plus base and constituencies. A party like the ACDP may have had some impact, but not a major impact. And then interestingly enough, the other big winner of this election, the Patriotic Alliance, came in off a 0 base because they had no seats in parliament and blew through this election and came up with over 200,000 votes. A really good showing by the PA. So I don't think they have been greatly affected by MK. But everybody else was impacted by MK. It was not isolated to the ANC. And so while the ANC may have been the biggest losers of this election, I would argue that it's impossible to say that the MK was not the biggest winner of this election. And now that we are where we are, there are many iterations that we need to think about going forward. We need to discuss coalitions. We need to discuss what kind of election we actually ended up getting and what kind of politics has come out of this election. And we also need to discuss what kind of ideological makeup of our politics has been left in the wake of this historic election. And that's what we're going to try and get through in this episode.
Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode.
So let's talk ideology. Let's talk about the impact of this election result on the ideological leanings of different parties and of our parliament going into the next 5 years. So the ANC, the EFF, have always been seen, or at least been seen in the last 10 years, as the progressive black parties. The parties that are pro-poor, parties that are leaning towards the advancement of the majority of people. And while there have been questions, particularly, I think, of the ANC in terms of its economic policies and whether its economic policies are moving and floating more and more towards the right, it has still been seen as progressive in terms of its values, issues around constitutionality, issues around human rights, and social protection. Those kind of social aspects of the ANC have remained progressive over time. And where questions have been raised ideologically have been around how progressive has it remained economically. But I think between them and the EFF, there's no doubt that those are definitely parties that have been seen as progressive. And they're the big ones. But then there have also been smaller parties. Parties like the PAC, parties like Good, in this election now coming in, Arise Mzansi, who are set up as center-left or radical left in the case of the PAC, and are sitting in the universe of a form of progressive politics. But when I talk about those parties, what has emerged from this election is a real disorganization and destabilization of the left. What we imagined the left to look like has suffered blows in this election, and is not as clear to everyone where those parties will go into the future. So with the MK party, while they may be seen as quite radical and progressive on issues related to the economy, there's also elements of it that are quite conservative when it comes to issues around rights, the constitution, and values at a values level. And we've seen this in the rhetoric of the MK party. We know that the MK party has been quite critical of the constitution. The most obvious way is the ways in which the constitution was used to ensure that Jacob Zuma can't be a member of parliament. That's something that they've said they want 2/3 majority in order to change. But there's also issues around rights, issues around whether or not people have rights in terms of sexual orientation. They've questioned things around abortion. They've held quite conservative views on issues related to human rights. And so on that basis, they're kind of half and half in where they sit ideologically. It's not as neat as you might think of the EFF or the ANC right now in terms of whether they're progressive or not. And that puts them in an interesting category, where a party like the Patriotic Alliance may see a lot of alignment with the value systems that Nkonto Sizwe puts forward. And even, I would say, to a greater extent, some of the economic postures that the MK party has. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Is there going to be an alliance that is possible to form between the MK party and Gayton McKenzie and the PA? It seems like that is a possibility and creates a very particular kind of ideological machination, as it were, that I don't think we've seen before in our parliament. We've really either seen quite center left and further along on both economics and values, or we've seen people on the right. And this time we've got these weird mixes in between. One of the other winners in this election when it comes to ideology are the right-wing elements of our politics. So parties that are values conservative on issues like rights and the ones that I've mentioned with the MK, issues around sexual orientation, issues around abortion, just the protection of a broader human rights framework in the Constitution. Those parties have done actually quite well. And it's important to think about a consolidation of parties with a particular values bias towards a more conservative politics, having either remained quite steady, withstood the MK incoming onslaught, and sit in parliament with a voting bloc around those issues that I think is going to be significant going forward. It's not inconsequential, even if those parties aren't able to make up a government. So John Steenhuisen has already said that the Moonshot Pact is unlikely to be able to form any kind of government. And many of those parties, including the IFP, sit on some of those value conservative issues and are in parliament with quite decent and solid showings. So there's going to be a block when it comes to our lawmaking and the way we think about our society and the way it should move forward. That's going to have a very strong values conservative showing in parliament. And if you add some of the ways that the MK has expressed itself to that, you can see that we could have very many moves and pushes in our elections or in our politics towards a more values conservative parliament, governance, society. But on the other hand, there's also right-wing economic groups that have done really well. The DA leads the pack in that. It is unashamedly on the right when it comes to economic issues. It believes in free markets and capitalism, and it's joined in that chorus with parties like Action SA and parties like the PA as well. And so you have a lot more of a push towards a capital-friendly, business-friendly bloc in parliament that I think hasn't had the same kind of losses that it suffered because of the MK surge. And so I think that we must look at parliament with that in mind and ask which parties that are there are on the side of being value conservative versus those who are more in line with the Constitution at a values level where it is now, which is quite progressive. Which parties are economically conservative versus those who are more radical in their ways of thinking about the economy, redistribution, and justice. And I think those shifts are going to be interesting to watch. What those blocks of power do over the next few years, I think is going to be absolutely important to watch out for. But I think net, when it comes to ideology, people on the right, both in terms of values and in terms of the economy, have had a really strong showing in this election, despite it being such a disruptive election because of the impact of MK. Now let's talk coalitions. I've often said that, we can't fear coalitions. Coalitions aren't something you vote for or something that you vote against. Coalitions simply happen as the outcome of an election. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what this means for our body politic going forward. What does it mean for our ability to hold parties accountable? I actually think this is a really good thing for our ability to hold political parties accountable in parliament. Let's forget about in government for a moment, but just in parliament. Parliament has been a place where there's been the majority of the ANC for so long. that as a majority party, the ANC has been able to make very unilateral decisions in parliament without listening to many forces in society or in parliament itself. With the ANC so far below 50%, for the first time since 1994, the ANC is going to have to be consultative about every decision made in parliament, from government, at any time. And this doesn't matter who they go into coalition with. That is an extraordinary thing. This means that the passing of budgets is not just a taken for granted. That the debates that happen around different votes in parliament are no longer just for entertainment and are no longer inconsequential. Everything has to be consulted and negotiated in a parliament where nobody has even close to a majority. That is a good thing for our democracy. It is an excellent thing for our democracy. And in fact, higher levels of transparency will come out of a parliament like this, where every party and every parliamentarian, I would argue, is going to have to start making a case for why it is taking the decisions that it's taking. Gone are the days of the ANC without any question, consultation, and with high levels of impunity, just makes decisions without society understanding why. And I think that's good for society. In general, that is a very good outcome. What it also means is that for whatever coalition government or minority government, because that's also a possibility that we'll discuss in a moment, whichever government comes out, there is more power in parliament for different parties to use the privileges and powers of parliament to get access to information, to set up committees, and to leverage the power of parliament to hold government and ministers and the president to account. And again, that is a good thing for our democracy. Again, too long, ad hoc committees of parliament have not had much power because they've been dominated by one party. And I think that that is a significant change in this election and something that should be applauded. The final thing in general around what the coalitions and a push towards coalitions and not having outright government means is that, interestingly, concerningly, all of us on tenterhooks, means that we are not just going to take for granted that the first sitting of parliament is going to produce a particular president from a particular party. Now, I've always said that when we elect at the polls, we're electing through parties 400 potential presidents. For me, that has never been more true than in this election right now. None of us can say with certainty that we know who the president will be after the first sitting of parliament. And what makes that even more precarious is that regardless of what the coalition deals are in public, every MP will have a secret ballot in order to elect the president. And so parties will need to go in with high levels of trust that their caucuses will vote according to what the coalition agreements have decided. Now, I want to add in here that the MK factor is going to be extraordinarily important for understanding why it's not just a given that those secret ballots are going to go along party lines. One of the things this election has taught us is that within the ANC universe, and not only in the ANC universe, I would argue across political parties, that there may in fact be people who are sympathetic to the cause of the MK party and other parties. And that people may actually be wearing one t-shirt and voting a different way. I've heard many people in the ANC universe say that they are worried that their comrades were in the same t-shirts with them, but weren't necessarily voting with them. It actually reminded me of the Trump election in 2016. I was in the US for a few months just before the Trump election. And no one would ever say to me, whether they were Republican or Democrat, that they were voting for Trump. Trump was the only Republican candidate by that time. And you just didn't hear anyone vocally say, I'm going to vote for Trump. And that made a lot of people within the Democrats believe that Trump wasn't as great a threat as they thought he was, because he didn't have the kind of support that you could see because people weren't saying they would vote Trump. And I think there's a part of the MK effect that we all missed, that there were a lot of quiet MK voters, silent MK voters even from other parties, who saw in MK the opportunity to punish the ANC and lent their vote to that cause. And the sympathy to that cause may be far from done. So I'm saying, as we go into the first sitting of Parliament, that it's really important for us to not assume that everything that we see is as it is. That secret ballot is incredibly important for understanding whether or not people's loyalties align with their parties, or whether or not people have sympathies in other directions and want other outcomes. I think we don't know the answer to that. So that brings me to the question of how coalitions will form. What are the different machinations possible, the different chess pieces on the board of coalitions? Of course, the ANC is in the driving seat of coalitions. Because it's got 40%, there's no way, I cannot imagine anything being possible where the ANC can have a coalition that forms a government without it. 40% may be a big blow, a 17% drop for the ANC, but it is certainly not taking them out of the driving seat. So we will invariably have a government that has something to do with the ANC. But how does that coalition come about? So there are three scenarios that are being punted. The first scenario is the much punted, much spoken about ANC-DA coalition, with the DA on about 20% of the vote and the ANC on 40% of the vote. The numbers number, the maths, that if the two parties went in together, it would be a very clean coalition because you would just have two parties' interests to be concerned over. It would give a 60% majority, which makes defecting on that first day when the president is being elected, when the speaker is being elected, and on different votes, much harder to do than if you have a coalition that's very close to 50%. And so that feels like an easy coalition numerically. However, politically, that is not the easiest coalition, especially for the ANC. I would argue not even for the DA. DA supporters might be pro that coalition because it's their only shot at getting a hand on national power. However, for the ANC, its voters, its supporters, its base may turn on it, may not see it in a favorable light if it goes with the DA. Now, this has been complicated by the invisible hand, as it were, the markets, by business interests. And I say that quite boldly because of all the sectors of society, it was business who came out of the blocks first, while we were still counting, and started making statements about the need for an ANC-DA coalition, putting out its interests. Is it wrong for a segment of society to express wishes? Absolutely not. All segments of society, I would say, should be expressing wishes right now. I wish that civil society was more proactive about expressing its wishes about what a coalition would look like. I wish that voters that have voted for these various parties would start being vocal about what their wishes are. So it's not wrong that business interests have come out and said what it is that their view is. However, that's not the only block in society that matters. And we must not be held ransom to the idea that the markets will crash as the decision that is made for our political interests broadly in society. If we are going to be punished for political decisions based on the will of South Africans, that's not democratic. That's anti-democratic. If there's going to come a backlash and a punishment for our political choices as a country on the basis of a democratic process that is undemocratic, all voices in society need to matter in this moment, and business interests cannot simply outweigh every other interest in society. But also when it comes to the DA ANC, politically, there's a third consideration that must be made. So it's the consideration of the base and how the base, their various bases feel. They have to consider that. They have to consider stakeholders in society. But they also have to consider other political parties and how other political parties may respond to this. The DA has clearly gone to its previous would-be coalition partners, the Moonshot Pact, and said, guys, all bets are off. We are going to go and have a conversation with the ANC, even though that had gone against the agreement that they've made. But they had to consider, and they have to consider now, what backlash comes from that. The DA stands very little chance of being able to work with coalition partners that it has walked away from now, if it goes the route of just going with the ANC. And that has implications for other things. It has implications for the Western Cape. If the DA does lose any support in the local government elections and needs anyone else, it's going to be a much harder negotiation with what would have been easy bedfellows before. The situation in Gauteng is quite precarious for everyone. If the DA wants to consolidate a potential coalition outside of the ANC in Gauteng, that will be made harder politically by having abandoned its would-be coalition partners. And so there are political consequences for the DA if they go with the ANC. Likewise, there are political consequences for the ANC if they go with the DA. Because what it does is it effectively leaves out of the governance conversation and out in the cold two major forces and mobilization forces in our politics. One, the EFF, and the other, the MK. The ANC already knows what it feels like to have a very vocal, organized, and active EFF in the opposition benches. The EFF has made the ANC's life difficult at many times in the last two administrations. To add then to that, the MK party, who has more seats than the EFF has had before, and more seats than the EFF has right now, you are really brewing up a political opposition that is going to be really tough on the ANC for the next few years in Parliament, and is going to be able to develop narratives that couch the ANC as moving in the wrong direction towards the DA at every turn. Politically, the ANC has a lot to think about if it's going to leave out of its coalition agreements the EFF and MK. So, not as easy as just the numbers number. The DA-ANC coalition may seem like an easy win, but it may not be as easy as it seems. The second option that the ANC has is the EFF. Now, by itself, the EFF doesn't have the numbers numbering. The ANC is about just over 40%, the EFF is at just over 9%. And so when they come together, they may be able to scrape 50, but it's barely a 50 plus 1. It really doesn't give them confidence to go into that first sitting. And so any agreement with the ANC would have to include and involve a third party at minimum. Now, that third party might be Sizwe, could be MK. I think that brings together a consolidation of an ANC universe that for the last 10 years has fragmented. Is there not a better unity project for the ANC than the opportunity to form a tripartite, as it were, ANC government with all of its different parts reuniting at the governance table? Politically, that is a real option. It's also a real option because I do not doubt that there are people within the ANC now who think it would be easier to negotiate with MK around the table than to negotiate with MK sitting in the benches, or even to negotiate with the DA on a case-to-case basis. Now, the EFF have done something really interesting in their negotiating. They have put down a list of policy issues that they are bringing to the negotiating table as their non-negotiables. Before the elections, emboldened by the idea that they would rise in their support, the EFF was saying their non-negotiables were around positions like finance minister. Now they're saying a much more tempered approach, where the non-negotiables are around policy issues and a case-by-case voting on policy issues, and perhaps some positions, but those are secondary to the policy issues. That makes them a more palatable negotiating partner for the ANC. Now, mind you, I haven't mentioned what the DA's conditions are. And that's because they haven't outright said what those conditions are in public forums. But the DA could come in with a policy agenda like the EFF has done. I think that that would not work for the DA. I think the kinds of policy issues that the DA would bring to the table would be too far-fetched for the ANC. The DA could come in demanding certain ministries, and the ministries that are important to the DA would not be the Ministry of Education. It's going to be the economic ministries. It's going to be the ministries where the ANC is pushing forward with radical changes that will affect business, like health, given the NHI. So its ministry and its positional asks may also be very difficult. However, the DA could just ask to do what the EFF has done in many coalition agreements at local government level before, and simply say, we will support you, you run the government, but we will only support you on a case-by-case basis, and we want to have control in Parliament, Speaker, and roles as chairpersons. That's the DA's best bet to be palatable to the ANC, because it can't do what the EFF can do in terms of policy. It will come out weaker to its own base and to its own supporters if it makes policy concessions. That's the DA's best bet. But back to the EFF, if it comes in, it has the opportunity to come in and bring with it a coalition partner or two. MK is one possibility, but the other possibility I think makes the most sense for both the ANC and the EFF in this scenario, is the IFP. The IFP tends to be quite center in its policy positions, and it tends to be quite amenable to the ANC universe. The EFF, the ANC, I think they could find each other. They also then give them a third party in the room that bolsters what the numbers are in the seats in Parliament. That seems to be something that can be negotiated over a long period of time, but is workable in the short term to make sure we get to the 14 days and we are able to elect a president and then form a government thereafter. So we've gotten through the quite complex two situations I think the ANC finds itself in. The third situation is what is called the government of national unity. This has been punted around. Before the election, I heard a few people in the ANC talking about a government of national unity, and now we're hearing whispers of a possible government of national unity again. What does that mean for coalitions? It means that the ANC reaches out broadly to many parties in Parliament and is conciliatory and doesn't just look at the numbers, but thinks about how do you get as many actors around the room that are able to come in and form a government broadly. This is something that happened in 1994, even though the ANC had a majority in 1994. Before that, it was able to, or had decided to, as part of the negotiated settlement, make sure that it agrees on a government of national unity that saw the National Party, the IFP, FF Plus, and others coming into a government with the ANC, even though it was not based on the numbers numbering. That situation would also have been, I think, a lot more necessary if we found ourselves at a point of a volatile situation where the country is unstable after the election and many concessions need to be made in order for a government to form. I don't think we're there. I think the government of national unity, while a broad option, is actually a very complex option for the ANC in its first national coalition talk. I think it will be much harder to manage such a coalition, and I think it would probably avoid the multiplicity of voices and try and keep it down to 2 or 3 bedfellows for this coalition agreement. Either way, that is something that's on the table and something worth looking out for. But again, given the ideological conversation we had about where the balances of power and the balances of ideological voices lie, the ANC would find itself dealing with a lot of parties that are either not aligned with it in terms of ideology, in terms of values, or not aligned with it in terms of economic outlook. And I think it would want to avoid having too many debates and discussions and divergences on the issue of ideology as well, which I think a government of national unity would present to it. And so we need to think about coalitions much broadly than just what the numbers tell us, and much more broadly than just what political parties might come looking out like at the end of it. We need to think about the various factors that will bring the most stable outcome in terms of the country going forward, and the most stable outcome in terms of a healthy policy debate that needs to happen over the next few years. So I think the final reflection that I have for this election is around, what does this say for us as the voter? Where is the voter? Did the voter win in this election? My answer to that is the voter has not won in this election. And I will tell you why. For me, as I reflect on this election in the last few days, firstly, many voters stayed away. Of the 40 million voters who could have come out, 16 million came out. Of course, 27.7 million had registered, but only 16 million showed up. And so that is not just in percentage terms a lower voter turnout. It really means that so few of us are deciding for the many. Really, only a third of South Africans are making the decision for the majority. And that's not healthy for our democracy. And as I've said many times before on this channel and other places, that the fewer voters show up, the more we leave politics to the politicians, and the politicians' impulses, whims, their different interests become the interests that are more important than those of the population. And I know many people were undecided and probably decided they did not want to be a part of whatever outcome ensues. But the truth is, even if you don't participate in the election and the creation of your government, you cannot run away from being governed by the government that emerges. And I want us as citizens and as voters to really reflect on whether we did enough in this election to make sure that our voices are heard. The second thing I want us to reflect on from the side of the voter is what kind of political terrain this election produced. And the simplest way for me to describe what I saw in this election was really a race to the bottom. The election was noisy. It was a very toxic environment in terms of the kind of rhetoric. It was very divisive. And it simply did not bring us and elevate the conversations we needed to have in society. I do not think the critical crisis issues of this country were the driving force of this election. There were a lot of personalities in this election. There were a lot of old scores in this election that were being settled. And so we had a race to the bottom in terms of bad politicking being the thing that gave the most coverage, the most exposure, and the most votes. And we must think about what that means. There's also a transactional nature to our politics that has set in at this point, where voters, in terms of our participation in campaigns, have been asking, what are you going to do for me, to the parties? And not asking the question about, how are you going to serve me and my interests, and how am I going to hire you and hold you accountable? I don't think we got to that standard. I think we were very transactional as voters. And we also, in some instances, the transaction may have been we were bought in to the agendas of political parties. But I also think that in some cases, we were using political parties for our own agendas. And there's something that's perverse about that we have to unpack. And then finally, when it comes to that noisiness, disinformation, misinformation, and conspiracy riddled this election. It was hard to tell the wood from the trees in this election. And as voters, I don't think we asked enough questions. As voters, I don't think we were aware enough to make sense of what was true, what was not, what was for political gain, and what was actually in the best interest of the country. And while the parties have to take a lot of responsibility for that, the voters do too. Because ultimately, we are the ones responsible for this outcome. Voters decide elections. Political parties can only go so far. But if voters decide, then that's what they have to deal with, the consequences of the voters' decision. And I don't know that as voters, we were our best selves in the context of this election. And so I'm going to leave my reflections there. I think that over the next few weeks, we're going to have to talk about what it looks like to show up as citizens, as communities, as voters throughout the next 5 years. What is our role? What is our responsibility? And what standard are we going to hold political parties to? For now, let's get through the next 14 days and make sure we get the safest, most stable, most reliable, and most accountable outcome that we can pursue for the next 5 years. Yeah. Let's continue to spread the fire.